Section 6.3, Solving Percent Problems. What is 50% of 8? 6 is what percent of 10? 7 is 25% of what number? In this section, we are going to discuss solving percent problems of the three different types that I have here, which are the most common types of percent problems you will see. Although there are several ways of doing these problems, I will talk about one method known as the is-of method. The is-of method of solving percent problems. Notice that in all three of these problems, you see the word is and of. Is and of, is and of, is and of. The is-of method uses the idea of a proportion in order to solve these types of problems. The proportion is known as is over of is equal to percent over 100. You know that percent means how many out of 100, which is why this side of this proportion is written that way. The is and the of stand for information that you have in the problem. The is generally the amount that you are talking about, and the of is generally the base or the total of that particular item. I don't tend to use the amount in the base. Instead, I use the is over of because these problems all have an is and an of in them. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. In order to solve the problem, what is 50% of 8, we are going to put the information from this into this proportion. And the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a percentage sign. Notice that I have 50 attached to the percent. So wherever I have the percent, I'm going to put over 100. Whatever I have for percent, I'm going to put over 100 because that's the right side of my is over of equals percent over 100. It says what is. I don't know what is. So I'm going to say that's my x, or I could put a question mark there, but we tend to use variables right now. It says of 8. The 8 is the of. So I have the proportion x over 8 equals 50 over 100. And now I can go through and I can solve that by using the idea of cross products. I know that 8 times 50 is equal to 400. So I know 100 times x also has to equal 400. So that x would have to equal 4, because 100 times 4 is equal to 400. So the answer to this is 4. Now if you think about this, it says, what is 50% of 8? Well, 50% is the same as 1/2. So it's really saying, what is half of 8? And the answer is 4, which you might have had from the very beginning. But setting this problem up into an is over of equals percent over 100 proportion helps you to go through the math to figure out the answer as well. Here's the second problem that I had. 6 is what percent of 10? I take a look for what number is attached to the percentage sign, but I don't have a number. It says what percent. So I'm going to have an x over 100 on the right side of my proportion. It says 6 is. So 6 is the top of the left-hand side of the proportion of 10. The of is equal to 10. So my proportion is 6 over 10 is equal to x over 100. Once again, I'm going to go through and I'm going to cross multiply. 6 times 100 is 600. 10 times x is equal to 10 times x, which also has to equal 600. So, in order to figure out what that x is, I'm going to have to divide both sides by 10. If I divide this by 10, I'm going to get 60 for an answer. So, the answer to this must be 60. 6 is what percent of 10? 6 is 60% of 10. And that's the answer to that problem. Here's the third type of problem that we talked about. 7 is 25% of what number? Once again, the number 25 is attached to the percent. So the right side of my proportion is going to be 25 over 100. I have 7 is. So the 7 needs to be the top part of the left side of the proportion. It says of what number? I don't know my of. So that's going to be my x. And then I'm going to put an equal sign, and then I'm going to use the idea of cross products again. 7 times 100 is equal to 700. So I know 25 times something also has to equal 700. So I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to figure out 25 times what gives me 700. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to do that division. 25 goes into 70 2 times. 25 times 2 is 50. I subtract, I get 20, and I bring down my 0. 25 goes into 200 8 times. 25 times 8 is 200. I get 0. So the answer to this question is 28. 7 is 25% of the number 28. And when you think about it, 25% is the same as 1/4. 7 is 1/4 of 28. And that's the answer to that problem. Here's another example. 7% of what number is 42? As I said, I always try and do the percent over 100 side first. So I see 7%. So I know that needs to be 7 over 100. Now I just need to identify what is my is and what is my of. It says 7% of what number is 42. So 42 is my is. It says of what number, so I don't know what my of is, that's my x. And then I'm going to put down my equal sign and use the idea of cross products to figure this out. So I know that 42 times 100 is 4200. So I know that 7 times x also has to equal 4200. Once again, I'm going to go through and I'm going to have to divide 4200 divided by 7 in order to figure that out. Well, I know 7 goes into 42 6 times. 7 times 6 gives me 42. I subtract, I get 0. I bring down my 0. Remember, I still have here 2 more place values that I need to fill. So 7 goes into 0. 0 times, 7 times 0 is 0. I subtract, I get 0. I bring down that last 0. 7 goes into 0 0 times. I get 0 when I multiply. So the answer to this is 600. 7% of what number is 42? The answer is 600. Here's another problem. Before I go through and set up the proportion, why don't you turn this off, set up the proportion yourself, and then turn it back on and see if you have the same proportion. Okay, hopefully you've gone through and set up the proportion. Perhaps you've even solved it. I have 60 is what percent? I don't have a number attached with the percent. So that's going to be x over 100 on the right-hand side. It says 60 is, so the 60 is going to be on the top of 800, so the 800 is going to be on the bottom. Now I'm going to go through and solve this. Once again, if you want to, turn this off, go ahead and solve it if you haven't yet, and then turn it back on again. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to go through and solve this. If I was going to solve this, I know that 60 times 100 is going to be 6,000, because remember, I have 1 0 here and 2 zeros here, which means I need 3 zeros in the answer. So I know that 800 times x also has to give me 6,000. So in order to figure out what that x is, I need to divide 6,000 by 800. Now, when I do that, I'm going to have to go through and multiply 800 times something to get me 6,000, because 800 can't go into 600. Well, I know that 800 times 7 is 56. And I'm going to add my 2 zeros, so I get 5,600. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to subtract. I'm going to get 400. But remember, you can't leave this now as just with a remainder. We want you to take this into decimal form. So I'm going to put a decimal point and add a 0 and bring that 0 down. How many times does 800 go into 4,000? Well, it goes in there 5 times. Remember to put your decimal up top. 800 times 5 gives me 4,000. So I have 0 for an answer. So the final answer to this is 7.5%. 60 is 7.5% of 800. Here's another problem to practice, and once again you might want to turn this off, go through and do the entire problem on your own, and then turn it back on again and watch me as I go through and do it. As I go through and do this problem, once again I see the 30 is set up with the percent, so the right hand side is going to be 30 over 100. It says 17 is, so the 17 is on the top of the left hand side of the proportion. Of what number? I don't know my of, so that's my x. And now I have my proportion set up. So I know 17 times 100 is 1,700, and I know 30 times x also has to give me 1,700. So now I'm going to divide 1,700 by 30. One of the things I like about this section is that you are being forced while you are doing this. Once you understand the is over of equals percent over 100, you're being forced to go back and just review some of this information that we talked about in the earlier math course. As I go through and do this, I'm going to say to myself, how many sets of 30 are there in 170? Well, there's 5. 30 times 5 gives me 150. I subtract, I get 20. I bring down that next number, which is a 0. How many sets of 30 are there in 200? Well, there's 6. 30 times 6 gives me 180. I subtract, I get 20. Once again, I cannot say there's a remainder of 20, so I'm going to add a decimal point, put the decimal point up top, and then put down the 0 and bring it down. And once again, I'm going to ask myself, how many sets of 30 are there in 200? Well, there's 6 again. 30 times 6 gives me 180. I'm going to subtract, I'm going to get 20, and then I could bring down another 0. And at this point, you are probably seeing that there's a pattern. That 6 is going to continue. So it is 56.6 with a line over it as far as the answer goes. Now, 56.6 with a line over it is also 56 2/3. You could have either one of those two answers, 56.6 with a line over it, or 56 2/3. It doesn't matter which way you go as far as giving that final answer. I mentioned to you at the beginning that all the problems had an is and an of in them. Well, this is one that does not, and every now and then you may see that. This says find 160% of 200. It has the percent sign with it. It has the of and the 200, but there is no is. But it's just that the person that wrote up the problem, instead of saying what is 160% of 200, they just said find. And sometimes you do need to recognize that. So if I replace the word find with what is, then that problem works out just like all the others. I have 160%, so I'm going to have 160 over 100. My of is 200. The find, or the what is, That's what I do not know, so it's x over 200. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to solve that. As I go through and solve that, I know 200 times 160. I'm going to do that by just saying, well, I know that 2 times 16 is 32, and then I need 1, 2, 3 zeros. So I get 3 zeros, so that's equal to 32,000. So now I need 100 times x also has to equal 32,000. So now I'm just going to divide 32,000 divided by 100. Remember, when you divide by 100, you can go through and do the long division, but there's a decimal point right here after 32,000. If I'm dividing by 100, I just have to move the decimal point 2 spots to the left, 1, 2. So the answer to this is 320. Here's one more example, and once again the wording is a little bit different. Find the base if 11% of the base is 55. Well, I do know what my 11% is. I know that that is the 11 over 100 on that right-hand side. I also know is 55, so I have a 55 on the top. It said find the base if 11% of the base. You don't know what the base is because you're finding the base. So that's my x. So now I have my proportions set up. I know that 55 times 100 is 5,500. So I know 11 times x also has to give me 5,500. So now I'm just going to go through and I'm going to do my division. 5,500 divided by 11. As I do that, I know that 11 times 5 gives me 55. I'm going to subtract, I'm going to get 0. I'm going to bring down a 0. 11 goes into the 0. 0 times, 11 times 0 is 0. Once again, I subtract, I get a 0. I have to bring down that last 0. 11 goes into this 0, 0 times. 11 times 0 is 0. I still get 0. So the answer to this is 500. Okay, so 11% of 500 is 55. In the next section, we are going to look at applications of percent problems. But as we do them, we are going to follow the same ideas that have been presented here. Please be sure to ask me any questions that you have as you work through this section. Thank you.